Over the years, Feel Like You Belong has been committed to sharing moving immigrant stories. However, there is one American population for whom this narrative is ill-suited: the ancestors of enslaved Africans brought to this country beginning in 1619. With us today is a national expert to help us frame that discussion in a larger context. Dr. David Pilgrim is professor of sociology at Ferris State University and the founder and curator of the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. David, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So a little bit of biography first. You were born in New York, but then moved very, very young to Mobile, Alabama. Talk a little bit about your early days and family and growing up.
Well, I don't remember New York because I left there. I was probably one or maybe younger than that. And I often think to myself how different my life would have been had I been raised in Harlem versus Mobile, Alabama. Because when I grew up in Mobile, it was right at the end of the Jim Crow period. And, didn't have much money, actually didn't have any money. So grew up poor. I have a thing, I kind of dread to say it, I'll say it anyway, but I grew up in the Deep South where the blacks were blacker and the whites were meaner. And I mean that is no disrespect to anyone, it's simply an observation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent the first 17 or 18 years in Mobile. Left there, went to Jarvis Christian College, which is a historically black college in Hawkins, Texas. And from there went to the Ohio State University, got my master's and doctorate, and then happily found myself in Big Rapids at Ferris State University.
Sure. So the museum, which I referenced in the introduction, deals with artifacts, and in a very influencing way in your life. There were two moments where artifacts came into your life. Can you talk about a flea market in Mobile, Alabama, and then a college class?
Okay, I would say at least two moments, but yeah, those are two of the pivotal moments. I was probably 11 or 12. I don't know much about that day. I've thought about it a lot. Actually, I've been thinking about it a lot in the last couple days because I'm getting ready to give a TED Talk, and it's one of the stories that I want to tell.
You need to get it straight.
Yeah, so I need to get my story straight. But it was a combination carnival, flea market, and so there were rides, but there were also dealers selling odds and ends, and one of them had a table that had what people would refer to as like a mammy salt and pepper, Achamama salt and pepper shaker.
Sure.
And all I remember about that day is buying it, and it must have been cheap because I never had much money, so it's probably a nickel, and breaking it. I don't remember the dealer's response. I don't remember my response.
But right there on the ground.
Right there on the ground in front. Yeah, right there on the ground. I don't remember the second piece or the third piece after that, but I just remember always having this stuff. I think some of it was because in those days, you would find these objects in the homes of African Americans and others. And but that was sort of my introduction. When I went away to Jarvis, as I said before, it's a historically black college in Texas, and my teachers were primarily, though not exclusively, African Americans, and they talked a lot about Jim Crow and what it meant to be a black person, a brown person, growing up during what I would know today to be this sort of racial hierarchy, this caste system. And one day, one of my teachers, Dr. O.C. Nix, came to class, and he had a chauffeur's cap. And he said, "So what does this cap have to do with Jim Crow?" So we gave the answers you would expect, that during that time, America had a race-segregated job economy. Black males were relegated to being butlers and porters and chauffeurs. And he said no. And obviously we were not wrong. I mean, that's a right answer, but it's not it wasn't the answer he wanted. So we took turns giving him variations of the same answer. And finally, out of frustration, he just says, "No, this is what I wanted. If you were an African American during Jim Crow, you might have had some success. I mean, there were middle class African Americans, and they may have wanted the same things that middle class whites wanted. You know, a nice home, nice clothing, a nice car. But if you bought a nice car and you were driving, especially through the rural South, and you were stopped by a white police officer, a white gas attendant, or just a white citizen, they may have resented the fact that you were driving this nice car. And so you could reach over and pick up that chauffeur's cap and put it on your head and say, "This is not my car." But it said more than that, didn't it? Because what it really said is this car is too good for me. I know my place in this society. I'm not a threat to you. I am a person who understands his role in Jim Crow. I would not dare step out of that role.
Know your place.
Know your place.
Yeah.
And I think that day, I don't think I know to be true, that started some things in my head, because I thought, well, if this teacher could take an object which you wouldn't get that message from normally and teach about race relations and racism, then how much more should I, or how much easier it should be with the objects that I was starting to collect. And so that kind of planted the seed. And if you allow me, I'll skip ahead. There was a third sort of pivotal
Great.
time. When I got to Big Rapids, I think it was around the mid 1990s or the early 1990s. And this is getting harder. Yeah, this is getting harder. The university had given me 500 square feet, a room that was 500 square feet. Wasn't really a museum. It was just visual storage. But it allowed me to put objects in there, and I probably had about, a little over 3,000 objects. And so I could put them
That's
on.
not a tiny collection.
No, it's not.
Back
It's not
then.
tiny.
So
No.
You had
no.
been collecting for a while.
Yes.
Okay.
It seems tiny today, but no, it wasn't a tiny collection. And I would bring in students, and we would talk about the history of an object, what it meant, And someone said to me, there is an antique dealer who has a collection like this. You should meet her. And she's not that far away. And so this person, I don't remember if she was in Newaygo or Howard City, but I went, and I introduced myself. She was an African-American woman, elderly, and she liked me almost immediately because I was from down home. And she saw Alabama all over me, right? So we had a connection, even though we were separated by many decades. But she didn't want to show me her collection. And she said, the reason I don't want to show it to you is because if I do, you're going to want it. And I said, of course, no, I'm not going to want it. That's not what I'm doing. And she showed me her collection, and of course, I wanted it. But she was right. It was in a barn. It wasn't in her regular business. It was in a barn that was, not attached. It was a little bit of ways. And inside, from the floor to the ceiling of 3 of the walls, just every imaginable, horribly caricatured object of an African American you can think of. And then
so shelf upon
just
shelf.
shelf upon shelf, right? And then between the walls were these tall shelves, and it was just, toys, games. If you could name an everyday object, she had one, and I was overwhelmed. There were pieces in there that I had seen in books. There were pieces that I had. There were pieces I've seen since, but there were many pieces that was the only time I've ever seen them.
Wow.
And I remember thinking, what if I did what she did, except placed it in an academic, environment? And so I think it was at that, because I never knew what I was going to do with my collection. It was just taking up the basement of my home. But I think that time, that was more than just planting a seed. It was actually allowing me to see where I wanted to go.
Sure. But as a teacher, you recognize the power of artifacts
absolutely.
to provoke conversation and introspection.
If you show me the objects that a society creates and I don't meet any of the people in the society. I can still tell you a lot about their attitudes, taste, and values.
Sure, sure, absolutely. What we create represents
Mm-hmm.
who we are. So I want to work into the conversation Governor Woodbridge Ferris.
Yeah. I did not know much about, well, actually, I knew nothing about Woodbridge Ferris before I came to Ferris. And for many years while I was there, I taught sociology there for 17 years. I'm a administrator now, okay? But throughout that time, I knew nothing. I'm just, and the stuff I knew was wrong. Okay, so it wasn't just that. So I had what you might refer to as negative knowledge.
Okay.
But a lot of people do, as relates to Mr. Ferris. And this was the pivotal moment for me in this regard. When I got my position as Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion, I wanted to use the position to, in part, to change the culture of Ferris. So part of changing the culture, and you can appreciate this, is changing the visual culture of the school, right? So if you walk around Ferris, you see murals, but they were almost all, white people. And
In Big Rapids, Michigan.
you might expect that, right? But you shouldn't. And this is what I discovered. So I have this guy working who reports to me and is a friend, Franklin Hughes. And I said to him, go find a picture of Gideon Smith, who was reputed to be the first African American student, came to Ferris from Hampton, Virginia in 1910. I said, go find a picture. So we're going to get a bust done of him and put it somewhere on campus. And he came back with a photograph that had 3 African Americans in it, and Gideon was one of them. And I said to him, so who are the other 2? And he was like, I don't know. I was like, well, don't come back until you figure out who they are. And so he started digging, and he found that there were dozens of African Americans. They were all males, African American males who had come to Ferris between 1910 and the mid 1920s, and they were all from Hampton, Virginia, every one of them. So we're like, well, what's going on? Well, by this time, I was intrigued and was helping with the research. And what we discovered is that students from Hampton Institute, which is a historically black school there, they didn't have college prep at the time. They were in the Booker T. Washington model, which was practical, vocational trade work, and those trades open to blacks at that time. And so if they wanted to take college classes or college prep classes, they had to go north. And because of who Woodbridge Ferris was, he was able to bring them to Ferris. As a matter of fact, in 1902, he brought Booker T. Washington to Ferris Institute to speak. And when he was governor, did any dozens of things which would surprise most people. Long story short, those students who came, by the way, one of them was Belford Lawson, who was the first African American to win a case before the United States Supreme Court. That was not Thurgood Marshall, it was Belford Lawson. And Percival Prattis, who was the first African American to be admitted to the press galleries for the Congress. This was a bunch of people. So it was, and actually Franklin and I are now finishing a book about those individuals, but it's also a book about Woodbridge Ferris.
Absolutely.
Because he created this space. We found quotes from him that if you did not know, if I didn't tell you who the author of the quote was, you would think it was Martin Luther King. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, where he's talking about the way to deal with racism is racial reconciliation based on love.
So he was ahead of his time.
Oh my goodness gracious!
And would probably be very proud of.
Well, I hope
the museum today.
Yeah.
So before we run out of time, what will visitors see when they walk into your museum?
When you come in the museum, we probably have about 8,000 pieces on display. Most of it is either segregation memorabilia or it's anti-black everyday objects that were used to support Jim Crow. There's a small section on civil rights, small section on African Americans' response to Jim Crow. And by the way, I'm glad you asked me that because we're now too small. If we have 8,000 pieces in being shown, we probably have 8,000 not being shown. the last couple years, we've received thousands of donations from people around the country. So my last dream is to build a much bigger museum, one that has state-of-the-art technology. So, for example, a person in Orlando or in Kentucky or whatever can, in a real time, experience what's going on in the museum. Where we can, we just received Bruce Davison's, some of his portraits, some of the most famous and iconic civil rights images. Someone just donated a couple $1 million of those to the facility. So we need to be a place that can be good stewards of that.
Absolutely.
So that's the last part of the dream, and then I can just lay down.
And pass the baton and let somebody curate
Let someone else take it, yeah.
Absolutely. So I had the real privilege of seeing one of your traveling exhibits when it was brought down from Ferris on display in Grand Rapids. And only with those 30, 40, 50 pieces was profoundly moved at the emotions that they draw out, and can only imagine if this is pervasive, if these objects are sprinkled across society, what does that say to you as a person of color and your place and your value? And then correspondingly, what does it say in terms of empowerment that white folks can just put these out there and do, with this cultural appropriation, representation. And so I want to encourage all of our viewers to come and pay a visit, because it's really profound. What is the response of your visitors?
Well, I think for some, it's a kind of profound sadness. I think for many people, where the sadness is a part of it or not, I mean, they learn a lot, because we're also very much focused on being an educational facility. And so we want people to understand the historical context of objects. So I think people, they appreciate the fact that it's done well. I hope that doesn't sound immodest, that it's academic in its focus. And we always have a docent there. We're free and open to the public. We always have someone there, because the purpose, we're not a shrine to racism. If anything, we're a shrine to the resiliency of African American people, specifically, maybe Americans in general, and we are a space where people can have intelligent conversations about race relations, and racism, because we're not having that in many other places.
Yep. Last question, what's your favorite artifact at the museum?
We have one of the ink pens that President Johnson used to sign the 1964 Civil Rights Act into law. And so that gives me goosebumps. It didn't end Jim Crow in our culture, otherwise we wouldn't have needed the civil rights movement, but it officially ended it. And so being a part of that history, but there are many pieces in there that move me in many ways.
So how do our viewers find out more about your good works?
Well, they can just type in Jim Crow in Google, and it'll pull you right up to our site. We have thousands of visitors from all over the world. And we have what I believe to be an outstanding web presence too.
Awesome.
And they can do a really quick virtual tour on the through the web.
Super. Time has flown by. We really want to thank you for coming by and sharing your story with us and your marvelous museum. And we hope that our viewers will take advantage.
Well, thank you, and they're welcome.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. If you're watching us on TV, stay tuned for our following segments on language and culture. If you're watching Feel Like You Belong on the internet, we hope you will share your feedback with us via our website and YouTube channel. And be sure to catch our many other stories about the passionate people who help us understand where we've been in order to guide us where we need to go.